Okay, now we're rolling. Okay, so let's see. What's today's date?
The 9th, Sunday.
Okay, May 9th, 2010, here with Richard Stover, author of 6 Silver Moonbeams, the first, I guess, it was the first English language biography of Agustin Barrios Mangore, right?
It was the first extensive biography of Agustin Barrios Mangore, also in terms of the actual scope of it and length.
Well, how did you first become aware of Agustin Barrios Mangore? When was your first exposure to him, and what prompted you to have such a long, lifelong interest in him and in his music? How did it all start?
Well, it happened that when I grew up in California, and I went to school from an early age there. I actually moved there when I was an infant with my folks who were from the Midwest, Iowa. And I grew up in California, and I went to school, and then when I was in high school, I was very fortunate to be chosen as an exchange student in the American Field Service program, and I got to go for a summer to the Central American country of Costa Rica, where I discovered Latin culture. I bought my first little guitar, and I started learning chords and singing songs and getting sort of into that aspect of the guitar. And then one day I went to a party and I saw this guy play classical guitar, which I didn't know what it was, but I noticed his hands were like, moving around different than my C and F and G7.
Yeah.
So I asked him afterwards, what's that you're doing there? What was that? And he says, well, that's guitarra clásica, classical guitar. And I said, well, how do you learn that? He says, well, it's hard to learn by yourself. It's better to get a teacher. I had a great teacher named Mangore. So I hear, he tells me this, and it doesn't mean anything to me, of course, because I didn't know who Segovia was or anything even then, or about the classical guitar. But he said, if you want to learn this style, you should get a teacher when you get back to California, and you probably will be able to do it. So I was stoked about that, and I went back to California, and I did get a teacher, and I started out in the Carcassi method, and I couldn't read I didn't know how to read music, so the first 6 months were just terrible. And I almost quit because I was musical, but learning how to read and play at the same time is initially like trying to rub your head and pat your stomach or something. So I made it though, and after a year I was making progress, and finally I was studying, getting good. I had a good teacher who put me into Sor and Aguado and Carcassi and all the basic type of guitar repertoire that is good to form your foundation with. And then later I studied with a guitarist in San Francisco who was a student of Segovia named Ako Ito. And I studied Villalobos and Bach and some of the Segovia repertoire with her. Then when I went to Spain in 1966, I was in college, and I went to the University of Madrid, where I wasn't doing guitar, but I went to Spain to study guitar because I was really into guitar by that time, my third year in college. And the university that I went to in California when I got out of high school and went to the university in 64, they didn't have guitar in the music department. I went in and played the Villalobos Prelude No. 1 for the dean of the music department. He says, that's really good, but you have to take piano. So, I took a semester of piano and said, I don't like piano that much. It's not my instrument. So I decided not to be a music major because they had no guitar at all. So I was a Spanish major because I've always had an easy time with Spanish. And I was taking Spanish literature courses at the University of Madrid, and also one really interesting course from Rodrigo, who had a chair there, the Manuel de Falla chair, and he would come in and lecture once a week on the music of de Falla and Turina. Well, that was a real interesting time in Spain in 1966, 67. I studied with an Argentine guitarist named Jorge Fresno, who was a student of Narciso Yepes, and he taught me the Yepes right-hand technique. And he also turned me on to Argentine music for guitar with the more of a folkloric bent, like Hector Ayala, that kind of music. And I really liked it a lot, and it was expanded my mind. He didn't know much about Barrios, but what happened was I was in Spain, and I met an Argentine guitarist there who was going back to Buenos Aires, and so I left Spain and took a boat from Barcelona to Buenos Aires, and I spent about over half a year, almost a year in Buenos Aires, surviving and learning about the culture in Buenos Aires and appreciating incredible music and the guitar. I discovered Eduardo Falú and Atahualpa Yupanqui, and one night I went to a club and heard Astor Piazzolla play with his quintet, and it was incredible, and it blew my mind actually, and it made me aware that there was so much guitar energy in Argentina that it was actually way beyond Spain, in my opinion. It blew my mind how many people were into the guitar and different styles of the guitar: tango, folklore, classical, jazz. So after being in Argentina and going back to California, I had transformed my consciousness about the classical guitar, and I started thinking along the lines of, because this was back in the 1960s when there was no concept of the Latin American guitar bag like today. It didn't exist. The only thing about Latin America was like a few pieces that Segovia played, and kind of that was it, for a long time. Norteña, Ponce, Villalobos Preludes. Segovia hardly played any Latin American music, to be honest about it. So it didn't have any kind of entrance into the repertoire through the official approved channels. If you picked up a record by Eduardo Falú and heard him wail on his milongas and sambas and stuff and realized what he was doing was pretty complex and very unique, albeit not European at all, then you have your mind blown if you are exposed to that. But of course, these guitarists never really did come to the United States to any great degree. When I think Falú came to the U.S. once or twice in the 60s, and that was it. So that kind of music never got much play. But I was very interested in it, and then I started to realize that because of my experience in Costa Rica, and I'd also gone to Mexico one summer, I realized the guitar was an incredible instrument all throughout Latin America that had become so incorporated into all these cultures in an important way that it was mind-blowing, because there's no place on earth did that happen. And the Spanish brought the instrument, but the Latin Americans, when they, settled in and had the factors of mixing gene pools and cultures and having isolation enter into the picture, it created what we know today as all these styles of Latin American music and all these different kinds of guitars and ways that they play them. It's just amazing. So after I'd thought about this more and went back to university because I took off for a couple years and just became a musician. I actually played electric guitar in a group and played in Las Vegas and Reno and did a bunch of things like that. But then I got tired of that and went back to school. And when I went back to school, I wanted to focus on Latin American guitar, because by that time I'd focused in my mind that it was a whole incredible area that had to be investigated and divulged, because there's a big repertoire from Latin America when you look at all the different countries there are and all the different guitar composers and how long it's been going on. It's really amazing. So, I made up my mind around 1973 that I would dedicate myself to Latin American guitar and quit playing Bach and, the normal Segovia type repertoire, and really dig into this other area. And that's what I, started doing in the 70s. I started writing articles, and then my big research project when I was an undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz was Barrios, and that led to the first edition of Barrios in the late 70s. And my whole involvement with Latin American guitar has been rather, not just Barrios, but I'm interested in all kinds of Latin American guitar music, and I've been, been to a lot of countries and checked it out. And it's, it's just an amazing thing, and I have a lot of fun doing it, of course, because it's music that turns me on. Yeah. And I wouldn't do it, just because it's novel or unknown.
Right.
I get off on playing it, and so it's easy to. And I'm very sincere about my declarations in the past that Barrios is one of the great geniuses of the guitar.
Yeah, well, I'm going to go back to one thing. So your first teacher in Costa Rica was a student of Agustin Barrios.
Well, he really wasn't my teacher. He showed me some stuff, and he made me aware that, God, I got to get a teacher.
The first classical guitarist you met.
Yeah, because he made me aware of all that.
So what happened?
I couldn't play anything.
Between the time that you met him and you wrote your first paper on Barrios, what I'm kind of interested in the beginnings of when you first become aware? What happened?
Mhm.
Did his name suddenly start
Here,
continually?
well,
appearing?
when I was in Costa Rica in '62, the name was planted in my head. I forgot about it because Trejos, the Mangoriano that I met, he told me about his Barrios, and it entered in. The name went in one ear and out the other. And then I went back and started studying classical guitar, and these went on a completely different thing. Well, when I was in Buenos Aires a few years later, the name of Barrios would come up with guitar people, and it was usually kind of like, oh yeah, they say he was really a genius or something, but we don't know much about him. And that was usually how far it went. So that was kind of weird when I thought, I went to recording and I bought 2 pieces of music by Agustin Barrios, the Prelude in G minor, which is Prelude Opus 5 number 1, and the Waltz number 4. Those were 2 works of 10 works that Barrios originally published with another editorial that sold them to Ricordi, and then Ricordi trimmed them down to just 2 pieces by the 60s. And so I bought the music, and I thought it was really hard because those are hard pieces. And at that time, I'd only been playing classical guitar about 5 years, so it kind of blew me away. But I thought, this is really interesting. This is the guy that Trejos told me about. He's got music published here in Buenos Aires. Well, that's pretty neat. I think I should find out more about him. That was sort of the beginning of kind of, put it all together there. There was that, and that. And so then I started, really starting to investigate. I got more music. I got more information in the form of articles and stuff out of books. And then, of course, when I went back to university, I was at the University of California in 1974. In the summer, I went on a long 3-month journey from Mexico down to Panama. And that's when I really struck gold in El Salvador and Costa Rica, because those were the countries where he lived and left a lot of music and whatnot, photos, memorabilia, programs, and whatnot. So when I came back from that jaunt that summer to my last year at the University of California at Santa Cruz, I had a huge amount of information, new information and music about Barrios, and it was really kind of stepped up to a whole nother plane. But still at that time I hadn't visited here, Paraguay. And I knew I knew I had to come to this place to really complete the story.
Right, where Barrios was born.
And what happened was I took Barrios to the point where I did 4 volumes of his music with Bellman Mills, which have been out for many, many years, and were superseded, of course, by what I did a few years ago in Mel Bay in the 2 volumes. But I did that, and then I sort of expected the classical guitar world to really take off with it, and it didn't happen. And it took a while for people to accept Barrios because it was something new, and it came on in a very formidable way of a lot of works. And I remember there was a criticism of Barrios written by John Ward in one of the soundboards in the early, I think it was the late 70s, about 78. And he said, Barrios was lightweight and salon music and, kind of a negative overall dismissal of Barrios. And that anybody who says he's a genius may have some other motivations for saying so, i.e. Stover wants to sell his editions.
Right.
So that really made me kind of irked me.
Yeah.
And I just sort of figured, well, let's let the classical world catch up, because I know Barrios is a genius and I'm just not going to worry about it. So I left California and I moved to Hawaii, and I lived on the big island of Hawaii for about 7 years, and I played in big posh resorts guitar a lot of hours and did a lot of work, because really what I wanted to do was play guitar and make a living playing the guitar, because it's hard to do that. And also I had a wife and a family, and we were, that reality was always part of what I was doing. So when I finally left Hawaii and came back to the United States, I found that the climate had changed quite a bit, and people at a guitar festival would come up to me and ask me to sign my books. And so I thought, oh yeah, well, this is much better,
Yeah.
And then I realized that David Tannenbaum told me once that, when you come up with something that's really going to be important and it comes up kind of new, it takes a while for it to be accepted universally.
Right. Now you were a Fulbright scholar to investigate Barrios. How did that come about?
Well, I realized that I needed to come to South America to visit Paraguay and Brazil and Argentina with the specific ability to investigate. I'd been to Argentina before, but didn't do any investigation at all. So I applied, and I got the Fulbright because I applied to do a teaching research grant in the country of Paraguay. And that was significant because it was a good country to pick because there weren't a lot of applicants. Plus, the theme of Barrios is very important for Paraguay. So I came here in 1990, and this place was quite a bit ignorant about Barrios. They didn't know all that much because he left here and never came back, and there isn't much information about him.
Yeah. Now, since Barrios traveled so much and left a kind of a big, wide, scattered paper trail in so many countries in South America, Central America, and now it turns out in Caribbean and also in Europe, how is it possible to kind of put together a chronology of like his life, because it's so scattered? Was it from the Barrios diaries that he kept himself, or how are you able to organize everything?
It comes from a whole combination of sources of information, you might say. First off, the albums that he made.
His recordings. Yeah.
No, his press albums, the big albums he made that he cut out newspaper clippings and pasted them
the
in.
travel diaries.
Those are 3 albums that are full of stuff. The one that has the Stravinsky postcard is one of those.
Right, the one where Stravinsky says, "I wish you good luck in the new year, 7 children," and
which proves that they met in Paris, beforehand. But the point is those were incredibly valuable to find out where he was. And then, of course, actual documents like programs that you can score or Xeroxes of them. Articles in old magazines, newspaper announcements, sheet music with dates on it and places of dedication, photos with dedications and places and time. Mm-hmm. All this stuff goes into the mix, to try to figure out where he was. And it's not easy because, like I say, he visited 20. Counting Paraguay where he was born, he was in 20 Latin American countries. And that's a lot of moving around with not so easy to check on that unless you have a lot of time and money.
Yeah. So you're pulling a bunch of resources to find information about him. Actually, let me kind of move ahead a few years. Barrios is known. Famous established guitarists are recording his music, so now it's getting more and more safe, or it's entering the repertoire where more and more people. So, and you're still doing research on him, and pieces are coming up. So, as you're doing research, you're also finding original manuscripts or published pieces. When things are starting to happen, tell me about some of your eureka moments, like where you're looking for something and you find something, either a bit of information about, he played here at this really important theater, or here's a piece of music that I didn't know about.
There was so little information at the beginning that almost anything I found was exciting. Because when I started with very little, I had to obtain things through the mail and wait for stuff and scout around. And of course that was the days before the internet too, man. Everything took forever. And it was just a long, slow process. It wasn't like I started and did it in just 2 years or something. I started really collecting stuff about Barrios in the late 60s, early 70s, and then it got more intense as the whole thing multiplied with revealing the fact that here was somebody. When I first started investigating Barrios, before that trip I took that summer, in the summer of '74, to Central America, and discovered so much about him by meeting all the Mangoreanos.
By Mangoreanos, you're talking about?
The guys who studied guitar with him in the 40s, who were still alive in 1974.
So what kind of things would they tell you about?
Oh, man, they tell me about him, how he could improvise. He'd ask him, what's a key? Give me a key. G minor? Okay, man. And he'd start whipping off complex, interesting phrases. or they'd tell me about how he smoked a lot. But you know what was for me, the first, for example, now feature this, you know Julio Florida, right? Well, I never heard Julio Florida until one afternoon. I got together with all the Mangorianos and one guy played it. And the hair stood up on the back of, that's when I had hair. The hair stood up on the back of my neck when I heard it. I said, God, that is incredible. And you know, those kind of things are amazing. I actually met Julia Florida when I went to Costa Rica.
Yeah, tell me who is Julia Florida?
That was Julia Martinez de Rodriguez, and she was the niece of Francisco Salazar, who was a guitar aficionado, a professional architect, very successful, and a very talented artist. And he was good friends with Mangore, and both of Mangore's periods in Costa Rica, he was with him a lot and studied guitar with him. Mm-hmm. Gave him a house the second time he was there when he was down and out and didn't charge him any rent or anything. So she was the niece, and she studied guitar with Barrios in 1938 and 39 when he was there, kind of recuperating.
And so he dedicated the piece to her.
Yes, it's to her. They call it Julia Florida, not because I mean, the word Florida means flowered or bursting forth, you know what I mean, beflowered. We don't use it much in English that way. You know, we think Julia Florida, she's from Florida, you know. No, what it is her family called her that because at a certain age she shot up in height and grew real fast in a few years, and so Julia Florida. And that's what they called her in the family, so Barrios used that. And he wrote that he dedicated it in the manuscript on Christmas Eve in 1938 in Costa Rica. Yeah, it's one of his great works, no doubt.
Yeah.
And meeting her was a kick because...
what was she like?
Well, by that time she was kind of old, you know, and pretty laid back. She told me about her experiences with Barrios, and she whipped out under her bed she had a Simplicio guitar that she whipped out. Right? Yeah, that was her guitar.
Yeah, that's not too shabby of a guitar to have.
She
just kind of
unfortunately was killed in a traffic accident, being hit by a bus several years later. So I never got to get back to her or anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, what other pieces can you describe that kind of have a story about them? That maybe some of the greatest hits of the Barrios repertoire, that you have some facts or some interesting things, personal experiences with. I know that probably is, say, describe a letter of the alphabet, you know.
Well, I think getting the records that he made in El Salvador, the outtakes, because the original records were destroyed. These were records that he made way after the era when he stopped making commercial records in 1929. In Argentina, he didn't make records for a long time, and then this fellow who owned theaters in El Salvador, in San Salvador, had a Crosley home recording machine, which was one of those early machines that people could buy and then make these real thick vinyl discs with a needle, you know, and so they had that, and he sat down and he played Diana Guarani and Invocación a la Luna, and there was some, he did El Sueño de la Muñequita too, and those, the two themes that were the final takes were put on records and sent to Washington, D.C. in 1943 and played on the air and then sent back to El Salvador. And Juan de Dios Trejos had them, the guy that I met in Costa Rica. And he eventually gave them or sold them, I don't know how it went down, but a Paraguayan musician who was going on tour through Central America in the early 50s met Trejos and got the records from him and kept the records for numerous years while he was out away from Paraguay. And then finally in the late 50s he moved back to Paraguay with the records in his suitcase. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, when he arrived in Asunción and opened his suitcase, the records were broken irreparably. So they were lost. However, the day that Barrios recorded those records, he did several records that he'd only play up to a point and stop because there was something. So I got those records from the family of this Masi, the fellow who had the Crosley home recording, who contracted Barrios to play in his theaters. And I listened to all the takes on the 3 discs, and then I pieced together what seemed to be the logical order of the music, and it comes out to over 6 minutes. I can't be sure that it's 100% everything, but that's what we have of the piece, because he never wrote it down on
the Diana Guarani.
Yeah, and one of his greatest pieces in terms of the last part of his life, he used it consistently to end his performances. And I think the piece had a lot of meaning to him, because it's a piece based on a bugle call from the Paraguayan army in the War of the Triple Alliance called Campamento Sierra Leone, where all the soldiers were stationed during the war. It's about 50 miles out of Asuncion that way. And he started playing that when he was a kid here, because it's a real popular song. So as he matured as an artist and got back going back into his own Paraguayan identity, and then of course he made the big jump in 1930 when he started dressing like an Indian, and calling himself Cacique Nitsuga Mangore, which is Chief Nitsuga Mangore, and approaching a whole other way of theatrical way of presenting himself. This was all part of his mentality of, I think, staying kind of using his Paraguayan roots and the Guarani identity as a way to reinforce his own singularity, because up until 1928 he was Agustin Pio Barrios, and he had played hundreds of concerts that way. And then he suffered, a defeat, you might say, when he was rejected by the audiences in Buenos Aires in 1928, with Segovia there at the same time filling up theaters. So he was very disappointed, and the change in his identity came out a year later in Brazil, when he started moving north into very isolated, rural type areas with cities that didn't really have any kind of idea what a concert guitar was. And so this idea of dressing up with feathers and a bare chest and a headdress and coming out and playing, he'd still play Bach, and still play Soar and all the regular things that he played, but he would be just dressed like an Indian. Now what happened was he got more people to come when the poster announced Nitsuga Mangore instead of Agustin Pio Barrios. So it was kind of a pragmatic thing, and I also think it was, you got to remember something about Barrios. He suffered from a very serious disease. And this disease, if you know anything about syphilis, it affects your mind. And actually does start to affect your mind way before it gets in the terrible terminal stages where you go insane. I think his fantasy and all this had something to do a little bit with that, and I also know that he loved the theater because his mother loved the theater. And he met Paravicini, that great Argentine actor who blew his mind when he was, 20 years old, 15 years old. And went to Argentina and got in with the theater crowd, and he just liked, the present. And I think he really enjoyed being Nitsuga Mangore and stroking out there with his really well-built body, because he worked out, and he was, people, Mangorianos have told me that he was proud of his physique, and he'd get out there and wail, and people would be blown out, Most people would not really have any idea that somebody who would advertise himself as a chief, an Indian chief, would play a fugue in A minor by Bach, and really wail on it, right? So it was something that he did for 4 years in an area of Latin America that had no strong preconceptions about what a classical guitar or classical artist even should be. Then when he got to Mexico is when the Mexico City audience, they didn't get off on it. They thought, and he even got some flack about it's not dignified for the indigenous peoples. That we have lots of them here in Mexico. We don't like that masquerade, Yeah. And I think that's when he bumped into Salamone and did his friend. Finally, of course, then he got a patron, because you got to understand one thing. Why did he do the exotic? He did the exotic because he didn't have an agent. Now I've analyzed his career. His big Achilles heel was he never had a representative like Segovia, for example, who had Conciertos Daniel.
Let's talk a little bit about Segovia and Barrios, the two of them had at least one meeting. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I think they met on 3 occasions. They met the night they first met after Segovia's concert at the La Argentina Theater in early October of 1921. Okay, because Barrios went to the concert and he was introduced to Segovia at the concert, and then a few days later he came over to Segovia's hotel and came in and played on Segovia's Gut String Ramirez his works, and they never saw each other again after that until 1944 in the month of May, a few months before Barrios died in August of that year. And Barrios was in bad physical shape by the time Segovia saw him, how many years later? 1921 to 1944. 23 years. I'm sure Segovia had his mind blown when he remembered what Barrios was back then as to what had happened to him, because his last few years in El Salvador, his health really started to go, you know. And it's great that he died actually early, because if the syphilis had gone to its terminal stages, it would have, you know, really been horrible. Much worse situation. So he died of his lungs got fluid in them, edema, and that caused him to suffocate, which caused a heart attack. And so he took a while for him to die, evidently from how it went down, and it was very unprecipitated. He was feeling great the day before, you know. But with Segovia, going back to that theme, I'm sure that Segovia went away from the last encounter and think, poor Barrios, and that's why Segovia said years later in Compostela that Barrios was a man who destroyed himself, but he couldn't because he was a genius. In other words, he was saying Barrios changed his name, he changed his way of dressing, he had plastic surgery on his lip to reduce the size of it. He mismanaged his career and his health and destroyed himself, you know, in a certain way. And so that's probably the logic of what Segovia was referring to, because when you think of Segovia saw him in his prime and then saw him in his last year, that's an incredible juxtaposition of experiences. But I think what Segovia's problem with Barrios was that Segovia just wasn't interested in that kind of music. It's a plain fact. In 1921, Segovia wanted contemporary 20th century music that was, you know, contemporary in terms of what was contemporary in that time.
But not too contemporary.
Not atonal, no. But I mean contemporary with the polytonality and, you know, all the different things that composers were doing in the 1920s.
Right.
In that
but there's
era.
a famous story of Segovia meeting Stravinsky and saying, or Stravinsky asking Segovia, how come you've never asked me to write something for your guitar? And supposedly Segovia replied, because I didn't want to offend you by not playing it.
Right.
Whereas Stravinsky meets Barrios, and the two of them evidently, as evidenced by that postcard, really hit it off.
Oh, I'm sure Barrios was delighted to meet Stravinsky, and I'm sure Stravinsky was very impressed, because I think Stravinsky wanted to write a guitar concerto, is what I think. And that's why he even consented to see Barrios when he visited Paris in 1934. Mm-hmm. But anyway, going back to Segovia, I mean, Segovia didn't want to play that kind of repertoire. He had plenty of 19th century sounding music with Soren Taraga, you know, so he wanted contemporary stuff. So it's obvious that it's not, even though he may have said to Barrios, I think La Catedral is a great piece, can you give me the manuscript? I just don't think he was sincere. I think he also didn't like guitar players in general who composed, because the repertoire is dominated by that tradition, and he wanted to get away from that and get with serious composers from the wider world of music, you know. So his priorities were sincere and genuine, but unfortunately they meant slamming the door on Barrios, and in addition making a negative summation or judgment about the worth of his art. He didn't like the quality in Barrios's music that Leo Brauer refers to as being able to write later in time in a style that's earlier. You have a different vantage point, so you can actually bring in other things that have gone down. And if you start, and Barrios does that, he might sound, you know, a certain classical in one part, and then he might sound real popular in another. It's just a real melding of stuff that he puts together in his own special way. Well, Barrios Segovia didn't like that. He thought that was unmusical. And some people don't like it. They like their music, Baroque music is from this period and it sounds like this, and anybody who does it later is a phony.
Right. Sort of like the people that get real livid if the food on their plate touches. No, get that mashed potatoes away from those green beans. If they touch, I can't eat them. They're contaminated.
Well, if Segovia had played the cathedral, then it would have been a whole different story, but it would have created a certain inconsistency for Segovia, because Segovia wanted to stop playing music by guitar players. Mm-hmm. So why would he want to play a piece that's really a great piece by a great guitarist? Yeah. Well, he just wouldn't, Yeah.
Well, I do want to ask you about Bicho Feo, because that was, a piece that was often on Barrios's concert programs. Mm-hmm. And it was one of the pieces that there's no manuscript as of yet that's found, mm-hmm. but there's proof that he recorded it.
Oh yeah, he recorded it in 1914.
And then you found it.
Well, I found a disc in Buenos Aires, and along with a couple other ones from Atlanta Artigas label.
So was
that's one of 4 tangos he wrote.
Was that another eureka moment when you found that?
Yeah, I think so. Bicho Feo had been notorious for years as a piece that he continued to keep in his repertoire. And there's a humorous story behind it, that Bicho Feo means ugly creature or ugly bug or something on that order, and he was, this story I heard from a Mangoriano was this, that he had played somewhere, and then he was standing and heard some people discussing him, and they weren't aware that he was listening. And the woman said, "Ay, que bicho feo." Like, he plays really well, but what an ugly dude, In other words, Barrios was kind of homely, Wasn't the handsomest guy in the world. And I guess he found that, not insulting, but humorous, because the tango was billed as a tango humorístico, humoristic tango, and it's got that onomatopoeia, bicho feo, and and that in itself is kind of a wistful little thing. So the whole thing puts together, it's a jocose sort of piece. It's one of several tangos that he wrote in that period of his life when he got to Buenos Aires in 1910. He wasn't a classical guitarist per se. I mean, he had been playing in his native Paraguay tangos and all kinds of folkloric inspired music, and he did play aguado and sor when he grew up because he had a good teacher. And but when he got to Buenos Aires, he started hanging out with the people, and not in the conservatories, but in the cafes and the theater. And that's when he starts to crank 4 tangos that are really, all of Don Pérez Freire's an incredible tango. So all of these come from that period of 1910 through 1914, when he's in Buenos Aires and he's young and he's raw, and he gets a recording contract with Artigas Atlanta, and he cranks out 18 records in 2 years. And we now know he's not the first guitarist to make records. A fellow from Uruguay preceded him by a year named Julio Otermin, which is some recent research has revealed that he recorded on Victor label in 1912 in Buenos Aires. The recording industry in South America was well developed early on in those early years, and they had a lot of artists they recorded, and they'd record them on cylinders and then send the cylinders to Germany, and they would be pressed into vinyl discs and sent back to the Rio de la Plata from there. Yeah, it was a real going industry because, it was like iPods today or something.
Right.
I mean, it was the thing.
Right. Well, just like the huge film, in Argentina, films were really huge at that time too.
Sure.
We think of that
they were new.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, it was fascinating. Barrios owes a lot to Argentina. That's for sure, because his parents are from Argentina. Right. And he went to Argentina to launch his career, and Argentina was the place that rejected him, which caused him to become Itsugo Mangore. So I mean, it's a very important place for him. And his whole number of years in South America are very important. Uruguay is an incredibly important country for Barrios. He called it his second homeland, you know. He spent so much time there, and then when he left Paraguay. And he never really lived in Paraguay after 1910. He got to be 25 years old, and he split, and he never really came back to live. He tried to, but things just didn't work out, and he went back, and that's at a certain point he realized his life would be as long as he wanted to be a guitar concert person and not settle down and open a school or do something of that nature, he would have to just continually travel. And that poem he wrote called Bohemio is indicative of his realization that, gee, I'm never going to have a home. I guess I'll just have to keep doing this because that's what I'm supposed to do. And it's true, he didn't. He died far away from his home. And now they have a big controversy over trying to get his remains to get from El Salvador, where he died, to come back here to Paraguay. So
what's your take on that?
I think it's the kind of thing that can't be decided very quickly, because you've got a big investment in each country. They consider an El Salvador Mangore part of their culture. He had an influence there. So I don't think they're going to be able to do it very quickly, and I think maybe it will take quite a while. And I also think that Paraguay has to be ready to do something on a grand scale to warrant having the remains here. And I'm talking about like a big tomb in Misiones that's, not just stick him in a graveyard somewhere, a museum, you know what I mean? A real deal. And I don't think they're ready to do that yet here. I think they're just more into making it into a political issue of, I'm in favor of bringing the remains back, vote for me. Sort of, Mangore Barrios here has become a cultural icon, and politicians, don't oppose it. I mean, it was ignored for so long, and nobody knew anything about Barrios. Now it's become, in the last 20 years, since I first came here 20 years ago, it's just really changed a lot. And now, it's a kind of topic where a certain, public orientation would be pro Barrios is very good. It's important to be pro Barrios. Whereas before it was kind of apathetic. Who cares, Mm-hmm. But not anymore. So Salcedo can tell you a lot about that.
Let me ask you about kind of a parallel aspect of all this Barrios interest. I've certainly found this to be so, but I want to hear if you've also found this to be so. When you study a certain person in history, like say whether it's a musician or a writer or actor, mm-hmm. or it could be a scientist or whatever, usually a person of the arts, people don't always behave the same way with the same interest as they would someone else. Like, for example, the type of person who's drawn to a mysterious figure like Barrios is not going to be the same type of personality who's drawn to kind of a less mysterious but certainly extremely important personality like Johann Sebastian Bach or Mozart or somebody like that. Have you found that in your studies, your investigative work into Barrios's life and music, that there's difficulties in trying to find information that impeded your studies, or what's your? Well,
what I found was certain situations where people didn't want to show me material, or were senile and had a lot of fear, and that kind of thing. So in my research, the Bordi Pagola collection, which is now known, back in the 1990, I'd only heard about it. So I went to Uruguay, I went to Montevideo.
So if you could tell about the Bordi Pagola.
Yeah, I went out to Maldonado, where Bordi Pagola lived. I went up to the little house where his daughter Aida was still living. I knocked on the door, and she came to the door, and I said, "Hi, I'm Richard Stover, and da da da. And she said, well, I had some things, but I just don't think I can show them to you. I'm sorry. And that was it. And later I found that I had been sabotaged by someone who had called her and told her, don't show this guy anything. He'll try to get it from you.
Now, tell me, for people who don't know, what is the Borda Pagola collection?
Well, when his best friend in Uruguay was Martin.
Is it sheet music or is it biography?
Yeah, it's 28 selections and actually a little bit more of small things, but actual manuscripts of pieces.
Original manuscripts.
In Barrios' hand, about 28. And these were done and during the whole time that he knew Borda de Pagola, which started in 1912 and ended in 1928. So it's a 16-year period where Borda de Pagola got X number of manuscripts and collected them.
Borda de Pagola was...
Martin Borda de Pagola was a guitar aficionado who befriended Barrios when he got to Montevideo in 1912 and was his great supporter, and also not only put him up for long periods of time, but also sent him money when he needed it, when he was on the road and had a hard time, and was always urging him to write his music down constantly. And that's why he had these manuscripts, undoubtedly, because Barrios could write his music down with no problem. It was just that he was always changing it, and the act of creation was where it was at for him. Playing and writing it with paper and pencil is just an afterthought, really, in terms of what's really going on, with the act of playing, which is where he was so tremendously geared to. Can you imagine playing guitar 10 to 12 hours a day? I don't know about you, but I couldn't play guitar 10 to 12 hours a day.
When I was 16,
they say he did that.
Yeah.
And he did it, because he was so strong muscularly. And I don't know, I think that's superhuman myself. But I know when you play a lot of hours, you really get somewhere else with how you work, And he was always in that zone, because he was capable of doing it. And then of course he had a phenomenal memory too. They say that they'd say, "Do you know this piece?" And he'd go, "Let me see. It's right here on my fingertips. And then he'd get it and play the piece, And he had hundreds of pieces in his repertoire. So
I guess 10 to 12 hours a day for a few decades will do
whoa,
that.
yeah, cranking a lot. Yeah, well, he was extraordinary, and it sort of trapped him in a way. He didn't have any other profession. He was so damn good at what he did that he was always able to kind of get by and use it, so to speak. And like I said, he didn't have a mentality of a professional concert artist, really, of getting a manager as a necessary ingredient to success. He just launched himself and went out into the world and knocked on doors and visited 20 countries in the process, and played a lot of concerts, left a lot of music in a lot of places, and became a pioneer of the classical guitar in Latin America, without a doubt.
Now, what since you devoted so much of your life to this study of his music and him as a historical important figure, what would you like for people who don't know anything about Barrios? Why should anyone care? What would you like to say to them?
Well, my own reaction when I discovered Barrios, being a person who really digs the guitar and likes Latin American music, whether it's on the guitar or not, for me, Barrios is a great technical adventure on the guitar. He did things that nobody did. He utilized the 20 frets and 6 strings in a way that nobody before him did, and I don't see anybody else after him either, because music's changed so much now. It's traditional, tonal, architecture, tonic dominant, with lots of ingredients mixed together to come up with a unique personality of its own. Whether you like that or not is purely a question of taste. There's also another factor with Barrios, and that is it's very emotional, really, the essence of it. That's how he worked. He was a very expressive person. He would be moved and have emotions, and that would motivate him to compose or Of course, he was incredibly, from what they say, a very passionate player with a lot of emotional intensity, who sweated a lot. And all these things, went into creating a kind of an artist who was just extraordinary. But then here again, everybody goes, yay, in the concert, and and it's over with, and then he's all, he's back in the real world, and he's got to pay his bills, and go on, and it's really, it's a story of heartbreaking, not being in the right place at the right time, not making the right decisions, and suffering for it, because his talent was so great. If he'd have just done a few different things, his life would have turned out really different.
Like what?
Like go to Europe in 1921. Or not get ill, if he'd have done that differently. But his life would have been different. For example, when he met Gino Marinuzzi in Brazil in 1919, the guy who directed the opera at Milan, was in Rio doing operas, and Barrios played for him and his musicians, and he was real impressed. It's too bad Barrios didn't follow up with that guy and go to Italy. God, it would have been really different for him, But he never got to go to Europe until it was too late with 1934, and they went to Germany, and then Hitler was in power, and everything was getting very tense and warlike, and then he goes to Spain when he leaves Germany, and the Civil War is about to start there. So the whole thing of going to Europe for Barrios was a disaster in a certain way, because he didn't do hardly any concerts, and it was just basically a dead end kind of thing that never went anywhere.
But got to play on German radio at least.
Yeah, he did that twice, that's for sure. And but his life ended very young, 59. That's not very old.
Yeah, he was 59 years old.
That isn't very old.
No.
Wow. If he'd have lived just a few more years, we'd probably have a really bunch more neat pieces, because he was really starting to crank incredible pieces at the very last, starting with the Prelude from the Cathedral that he does in 1938 in Havana. Then he does Julia Florida. Then he does Una Limosna just a few months before he leaves. So he was really, on a whole other plane the last part of his life, where all of this work that he'd done and all of this ability and inspiration and creativity became very rounded and full. And you can see that in those Prelude in C minor is from that era, 1942. They're all really great works.
Mitchell
Of course,
works,
all of his works are really neat, because there's this stamp about how he did stuff, that's kind of taken a while for people to get hip to, in the sense that it's traditional sounding, but you can tell the way Barrios modulates and does things, it has a special kind of flavor in some ways that is traditional and tonal, but still has a personality to it. And I think what people respond to in music in time too, generation after generation, responding to sounds. Why do people still want to hear Beethoven? Well, because those sounds have certain meaning for the human condition, I call it, and it's going to continue to have meaning for people who are way after the time of Beethoven, and that's probably what a great work of art does. It speaks to the human soul and the human mind through time, because it's dealing with feelings and realities that are not geared to time and space, place per se. So I don't know. It's a kind of thing where Barrios' music probably will become more appreciated the quicker they can get it out of the guitar world and into the orchestrated world, or into some other mediums, and try to get more of a larger even audience interested in his music. That's something that's just starting to begin now. I was amazed. Just because he was such a great guitar composer. The guitar has such a difficult repertoire of not having music by great composers. So anything that comes along that's pretty good, you appreciate. But it's gone pretty much beyond that too. I think his music is really great. Has qualities about it that are being more and more appreciated.
Well, Richard Stover, the guitar world and the music world is indebted to you for your work, so thanks very much.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I hope you're having a good time here in Paraguay.
Yeah, I am. I haven't slept for about, how many days now?
Oh, my goodness. Well, tomorrow you can relax and go to one of the wonders of the world,
Yeah,
Iguazu Falls.
big water.
Oh, that's impressive. Yeah, I've been there about 3 or 4 times. You'll like it. Okay.
Sure. Thanks.
That's all, folks.
Bye-bye. Got some great stuff.